Welcome to another VeVe Digital Collectibles video, and if you couldn't tell by that intro and all of the New Zealand Post stamps on the shelves behind me, today we are talking about the NZ Post Series 2 1898 Pictorials series. And with us to talk about it, we have Ant Harris from New Zealand Post. And how much research did you put in preparing for this release?
Not as much as I did for the first one. I basically covered everything.
I know you're going to be super well prepared for this one, Ant. You always are. Now, before we really dig into this video and the history of the 1898 Pictorials, if you could pick one thing from NZ Post, the collecting shop that you all run, there was one thing that you would recommend to someone to check out, what would it be?
Everybody has their own kind of, when you get into collecting, particularly around stamps and coins and art prints and pins, people have particular themes that they like. But the first one, be no surprise, is Lord of the Ring, right? So I'm going to make a claim here, and I haven't researched it enough to actually 100% confirm that it's true, but I think we were the first country to put a movie on a stamp. Now, there's been stamps on commemorating historical movies that were really successful before that. But when we did Lord of the Rings back in 2001, so the stamps came out just before the movie, and the whole of New Zealand was kind of on fire about, this little country doing the biggest book in the world, the unfilmable movie. So I was thinking, I think we're the first, in that context, we're the first country in the world to put a movie on the stamp. And the movie was so relevant and kind of the beginning of this massive thing in the New Zealand film industry in New Zealand. We did stamp releases for the original movies in 2001, 2002, 2003, and then we've done, we also did them for the Hobbit movies, and then we're currently doing the 20th anniversary. And what's unique about the stamps that we're doing for the 20th anniversary is they're not just pictures from the movie put on a stamp, which they were 20 years ago. They've been redrawn by a wonderful artist called Sasha Lees, who's redrawn the scenes. And she was involved 20 years ago with kind of production and with the movie, so that's really nice to have her. And she actually she was the kind of the designer for the first two stamp releases, the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers.
I would definitely buy those, and actually I have some Lord of the Rings stamps right behind me, and that sort of ties into what these 1898 Pictorials were all about, celebrating the culture and history and beauty that is New Zealand. With that being said, in the last video, we really dug into the history of this stamp release. But Ant, for those who didn't watch, and I have that video linked down in the video description if you do want to check it out. But Ant, for people who missed that video or don't have the time to watch it, can you briefly talk about what did the pictorial stamp release of 1898 mean for New Zealand?
Yeah, so New Zealand stamps, as with pretty much all stamps in the world, had depicted a monarch or a president. For New Zealand stamps, they depicted Queen Victoria for 40 years. So pictorials were the departure from the almost universal use of portraits and monarchs or presidents. And New Zealand in 1898 was still a very young country. It was considered to be God's own, very beautiful. There were incredible, it was a growing country. So there was a desire to encourage migration and tourism. And it was off the back of a design competition that was put out to designers and the public to do a stamp release with scenery of New Zealand, and that was symbolic of the land. And they got 2,400 entries, and they chose 13, and one of them was printed twice because there was an error. And yeah, the rest is history, really.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Ant, but this second series will complete all of the stamps that were available in that original 1898 release. So for philatelists who are here to collect all of the sets, this second series will complete the 1898s, correct?
Yep, that's correct. So this is the second drop, so we've got 2 drops, 7 stamps per drop, 14 stamps in total, which completes the collection. And again, so for our first digital stamp ever for New Zealand Post, it's really exciting for us because this is still one of the the country's most popular stamp issue.
With all that said, we're going to go over the drop details, and as you know, Ant, you'll be right back on to give our collectors a little bit deeper context into each and every one of these amazing stamps. Scheduled to release on December 2nd at 8 a.m. Pacific Time, the NZ Post 1898 Pictorial Series 2 will boast 7 stamps in blind box, with a price of 6 gems. First in uncommon, we have the Kiwi stamp and its meaning 1898 editions. There's only 2 green stamps in this series, and this one is the deeper green of the 2. And the Kiwi's a pretty important bird in New Zealand, right, Ant? Give us some context.
I would be delighted to. So the 6 Kiwi. Before I talk about the Kiwi, I want to talk about New Zealand native birds. It's very interesting kind of history and evolution. So New Zealand birds evolved isolated land with no mammals, right? And so because of that, they really didn't have any mammal or human predators. So they developed or evolved various levels of flightlessness, ground feeding, and nesting habit. And many of them became quite fearless because they arguably had nothing to worry about that was going to eat them. Maybe a hawk or something, but certainly not a mammal. Now, introduce human beings to New Zealand and the mammals that come with it, particularly cats and stoats and ferrets and rats and obviously the clearing of land. Was a real shock to the native New Zealand bird life. So we have actually lost, since the introduction of mammals and humans into New Zealand, 42% of New Zealand's native wildlife. Now, some birds obviously can fly. Some are completely flightless, of which the Kiwi is one. So there were 32 different types of flightless birds in New Zealand. 16 have gone extinct, and there's 16 left. And many of those, of course, under threat.
Next, also at uncommon, is the 5 shilling Mount Cook, and this one is also minting 1898 editions. In the Series 1, there was a half-pence stamp that also featured Mount Cook, but in terms of physical value, this stamp is almost 500 times more valuable than that one in the real world.
Yeah, so let's start with the value, right? So it's a 5 shilling stamp. So back in the day, in 1898, 5 shillings was a lot of money. So it was the most expensive rate. It was probably used on large packages, maybe. So it was probably the one that was sold the least of and used the least. That's why well over a century later, for collectors, it's the most valuable because there's not that many.
The first rare in the series is the 5-penny Otira Gorge, and it's minting 1,498 editions. I love the vertical display and inset image on this one. And can you give us a little more background about this stamp?
This is the 5-pence Otira Gorge and Mount Ruapehu stamp with Snowy Peak in the background. It's also got like a shot of the mountain from a different direction in the stamp in a circle. The Otira Gorge is a deep and narrow gorge cut to the mountains of the Southern Alp. There was a road built through the gorge around this time the stamp was released, which was actually considered at that time a remarkable feat of engineering. And there was also a rail track and a tunnel put through the mountain. Mount Ruapehu is an active volcano. It's got great views. It towers above the desert in the middle of the North Island. Every time I drive past it, I stop to have a look. It's really quite remarkable to look at, and it's capped off by its own crater lake. And yeah, the lake is warm because of the ongoing volcanic activity.
Also at rare and also minting 1,498 editions, we have the War Canoe and Crown stamp. At 8-penny, this is one of the only depictions of royalty in the entire Pictorials release, and the design with that figure 8 is really impressive. What's the backstory here, Ant?
So you've got a figure 8 supported by fern trees and cabbage palms. New Zealand's often referred to as the land of ferns, and there's about 170 different types of ferns in New Zealand, which kind of, when people first settled in New Zealand, people thought was pretty amazing. So the upper portion of the stamp is you've got the imperial crown. The lower portion, you've got the Maori war canoe. The crown was probably copied from that on what was on Queen Victoria's coat of arms. And the Maori war canoe is quite representative of New Zealand. It's a large single hull war canoe. They could range up to about 30 meters, have about 100 paddlers. And they were unique in all of Polynesia because they were single hulled, and that was only made possible because of how large New Zealand's native trees were.
Next, we have our first ultra rare, and it's minting 898 editions. This was a 1 shilling stamp originally, and it featured some of the more unique birds of the region. Ant, please tell us a little bit more about these birds.
So both the Kia and the Kaka are a bird species, belong to a bird species called Nestor. That species now belongs entirely to New Zealand. So it's the only place you'll find those bird species. So the Kaka is a brown parrot. It's endangered. There's about 10,000 left. Large olive brown with grey-white crown, red-orange underwing, and deep crimson belly, and a lovely undertail. Now we actually did a Kaka coin, and which I don't have here to show you, but it's one of my. It's just beautiful. It just came out really well. It's one of my favourite coins that we've ever done. So I thought I'd throw that in there. Now the Kia is a cool, really cool bird. So it does closely resemble the Kaka. It's endangered as well. There's about 7,000 left. Now the Kia is one of the most intelligent birds in the world. It has unique problem-solving abilities. It was crowned Bird of the Year in New Zealand in 2017. It's pretty fearless. It's got lots of personality, and it's a real noisy bird. So it has the ability to rip into backpacks, extract boot laces, tear tents, and generally kind of wreak havoc with any object left unattended.
Also at ultra rare and also minting 898 editions, we have the 3-pence Huia stamp. Well, this stamp features a beautiful orange coloring. The iconic birds depicted were actually multicolored. I know there's some major cultural significance with this bird and with this stamp. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Ant?
Yeah, so 3 penny stamp. So again, looking back to all the conversations we've had about the history of birds. So the Huias are now an extinct bird. Very sad. So they were medium-sized birds, about the size of a magpie, black with a greenish gloss, beautiful orange wattles, and a broad band white across their tail feathers, which unfortunately proved to be their undoing. So they're unique in the world, as they were the only male and female birds to have different bills, different shaped bills, and they used to work together to, forage and whatnot. So the white tip feathers were highly prized by Maori and were worn in the hair as a sign of rank. And some feathers were also kept in beautiful carved boxes known as waka huia. Now, when Europeans arrived, European commercial collectors pretty much contributed to the bird's annihilation. So huias were, now we talked about the evolution of birds. Huias were pretty much tame and fearless and would come to bird calls, so they were really easy to catch. And there were at times mass hunts of the birds to gather the feathers to sell them. Despite the fact that regulations had been passed in 1892, the feathers continued to be traded until 1930. The last confirmed sighting of a bird was 1907. That was 9 years after the stamp was released, and there were unconfirmed sightings that persisted until the 1920s, but there's been nothing ever since.
And finally, at Secret Rare and only minting 598 editions, we have the legendary Lake Wakitipu Air stamp. We talked about this one a bit in the Series 1 video because that one featured the corrected version. And can you give us a quick refresher on this stamp and what had happened with it?
So yeah, the most famous stamp in the issue and the history is the stamp. Well, the stamps were printed in London. They did an initial proof of the stamps. They sent it to New Zealand. New Zealand noticed that there was an error, a spelling mistake. So they sent a message back to London to correct the error. The message didn't quite get through properly, and the first shipment had the error. And there are about 300,000 stamps with the error that arrived in New Zealand. It was decided to issue those errors rather than throw them away and produce correct ones. So that created a craze. Some collectors and companies, at the very beginning offered to buy the whole lot. That's how much interest there was. Of course, that was declined by the Postal Service, and they had lines out the door trying to buy this eraed stamp. So they had to limit it to one stamp sheet per person, and that eventually reduced to kind of half a sheet or quarter of a sheet. And the demand was so high that they then decided to reprint the eras so that they could keep selling it. And then they eventually replaced, once the demand kind of died down, they then replaced it with the corrected spelling. So the era is actually more common than the correct version.
That rounds out the entire 1898 Pictorials release. Now, Ant, after this, there's not going to be any more 1898 Pictorials. So if you had to rub a crystal ball, and I know we can't predict anything with certainty, what would you pick to be the next stamp release coming from NC Post here to VeVe?
Well, the first, I'll make a disclaimer because it's obviously I don't have the final decision of what goes on. But if I could do anything I wanted, I would definitely love to do Lord of the Rings stamps. Maybe some of the original ones, or maybe some of the 20th anniversary ones. Chinese Lunar New Year would be cool. We've got a great artist who does our Chinese New Year stamps, and we try and keep the same artist for the 12-year cycle. It would be tempting to do something on New Zealand sport, like our rugby team, both men and women's, known worldwide as being one of the best teams in the world. Or, we've do something on New Zealand birds or New Zealand wildlife. We've recently done a forest and bird stamp release, which again, it's an artist impression. It's not just photos. It's an artist impression of wildlife, but that's really, really beautiful. So doing something like that to represent New Zealand.
I would buy any of the stamps that you just mentioned. I'm pretty sure that a lot of the philatelists and collectors that we have on VeVe would feel the same. With that said, and do you have any final words for our collectors here on VeVe?
Thanks for the opportunity. Ultimately, we just want to represent New Zealand. We want to, draw attention back to New Zealand, provide high quality collectibles, and honor the collectors who choose to collect our stuff. I've got a great team at New Zealand Post that make all this stuff happen. So I'm really grateful to them. And thanks to VeVe, we're delighted to be the second country on VeVe producing stamps behind the United States. And we like the fact that VeVe kind of put the history and the passion for collecting as the number one goal. I think that's really, really important.
Well said, Ant. And from all of us here at VeVe, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me and our collectors about this release from NC Post. And for all of you watching at home, best of luck if you decide to go for this one. Until the next video, keep learning, sharing, and collecting what you love. This is Corey with VeVe, signing off.